We have been working our way through the Gospel of John now for several weeks, and today we've come to the point in this Gospel when Jesus is ending his traveling ministry and is heading to Jerusalem for the Passover festival and what we know will be his final days. The tradition in liturgical churches like the Presbyterian Church that we're a part of is to mark times like this with a special Sunday. And so we have what is called Transfiguration Sunday. And normally on Transfiguration Sunday, we would be reading from one of the other Gospels, and we'd hear the story of Jesus going up a mountain and taking Peter and James and John with him to pray. And while they are there, suddenly Jesus is transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. And then Moses and Elijah appeared with him, and they spoke to him. And that's not all. Then a voice came, and the voice from heaven said, "This is my beloved Son. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." It's a spectacular moment of glorification when God is truly revealed in Jesus, and his followers recognize that this is the fulfillment of the law, which was represented by Moses, who was present, as well as the fulfillment of the prophets, which is represented by Elijah. If you were to go to the PCUSA website to read about Transfiguration Sunday and what it means to us, it would say, "We rejoice in the divine majesty of Christ, whose glory shone even when confronted with the cross." And so we place this Transfiguration Sunday right before Ash Wednesday to point us forward toward the agony of the cross and the victory of the empty tomb. Now, you may have noticed in our reading this morning that you didn't hear the story of the Transfiguration in the gospel reading. I thought about pulling out and not using John this week and going with one of those traditional gospel readings, but then I decided, no, let's stay with it. Because we are at the point in the Gospel of John when the other gospel writers include that transfiguration story. So it had me wondering, so why isn't it in the Gospel of John? Surprisingly, it is wholly, and that's a W-H-O-L-L-Y, not H-O-L-Y, absent. Wholly absent. It's not in another place in the gospel. You can't flip a few pages and find it. Biblical scholars have been wondering about this for centuries. Why would something so important be left out of John's gospel, especially when John was one of the few disciples who was on the mountain that day? Wouldn't you think that the gospel that was attributed to him would include that story? Well, there are some scholars who believe that the incident on the mountain is not in the gospel because the author of John sees Jesus' entire life as a glorification of God. George Ladd was a professor of New Testament at Fuller Seminary, New Testament professor, I said that. And he said, John differs from the other Gospels in making the entire ministry of Jesus a manifestation of glory. And Dorothy Lee, who is a professor of New Testament from the University of Divinity in Melbourne, Australia, supports that idea. And she wrote that John did know something about the Transfiguration, and he did choose to tell it, just not as a single story, but as a series of symbols. She wrote that there were threads of the Transfiguration throughout the entire gospel. And two of the most notable places where we see some of these threads are at the beginning of the gospel in chapter 1, verse 14. And the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. And the second place that really highlights this glorification is in today's reading. In John 12, verses 27 through 33, "Now my soul is troubled," Jesus said. "And what should I say? Father, save me from this hour? No. It is for this reason that I have come to this hour. Father, glorify your name. And then a voice came from heaven and said, I have glorified it, and I will glorify it again. And the crowd standing there, when they heard it, at first some thought that it was thunder, it was so loud, and others thought it's an angel who has spoken to him. But Jesus responded, saying, this voice has come not for my sake, but for yours. Now is the judgment of this world. Now the ruler of this world will be driven out, and I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. This second story is at the right time. It's just not the right place. There is no mountaintop revelation of God. The story actually takes place in the midst of a crowd of people who were both Jew and Greek who were gathering for the Passover festival. But there are two elements of the story that are connected to the transfiguration. There are two things that are present in both sets of stories. One is the voice coming from heaven that speaks and identifies God is at work in Jesus. And the second, the encounter that marks the point where Jesus ends his traveling and the coming day when he will be glorified in his death and resurrection. So the details are a little different, but the glorification of Jesus is present. And while the specific story of the Transfiguration is wholly absent from the Gospel of John, there is much that John offers that is missing from the other Gospels. After that voice speaks and the people hear it speaking, Jesus begins to teach about what is coming, and he explains the meaning of his death. And he gives a series of sayings that help us to understand atonement in a unique way. Now, atonement theology is the study of how we understand salvation and reconciliation with God. The church has three common models of these theologies. There's first the ransom theory that says that Jesus' death was a payment that bought the world's freedom from sin and death. You've probably heard some of that. The second is substitutionary atonement, which says that Christ's death is necessary to atone for the human guilt and sin. And the third is known as the moral influence theory that understands Jesus' death as an example of moral behavior because it reveals to us how much God loves us. So three different theories of atonement that are pretty common. But the concepts of ransom and substitution are wholly absent from this gospel's understanding of the cross. The moral influence theory, with its understanding that Jesus' death is an expression of God's love for us, is certainly present. But there's still something missing that the Gospel of John wants us to look at. In this gospel, Jesus explains his death requires a response from his followers. He describes his death as a necessary and life-giving moment because, as a result of his death, a community is formed. Have you ever thought about that? Verses 25 and 26, Jesus said, "Those who love their life will lose it, and those who hate their life in this world will keep it for eternal life. Whoever serves me must follow me, and where I am, there will my servant be also. Whoever serves me, the Father will honor." In this gospel, discipleship is defined as serving Jesus, and the goal of this discipleship is a restored relationship with God. But what is striking is that this isn't just a personal reconciliation that John is speaking of. The connection between Jesus' death and the life of the believing community is repeatedly stressed. We don't often think about Jesus' death in this way. I mean, most often I think we've probably learned that Jesus' death was for me, for you, for each of us personally. I mean, think about all of the songs and the hymns that we sing in worship that reflect that kind of personal theology. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Or, and when I think that God, his Son not sparing, sent him to die, I scarce can take it in, that on the cross, my burden gladly bearing, he bled and died to take away my sin. Or, just as I am, without one plea, that thy blood was shed for me. And one that's more contemporary. Some of you may not have ever even sung this one. The lyrics go, and as he stands in victory, sin's curse has lost its grip on me, for I am his and he is mine, bought with the precious blood of Christ. Got me to wondering how many hymns have been written that celebrate the fruit of Jesus' death as the believing community. Can you think of one? Can you think about an Easter hymn that celebrates that the community is born in his death? There may be one. I just couldn't pull it out of my memory. Certainly, there is no doubt that the personal relationship with Jesus is a part of the equation, but John suggests that it's not the entire equation. In this gospel, reconciliation is all about relationships. The first one being Jesus' death is the ultimate expression of his relationship to God and his relationship to all of us. Then we have the choice to believe in Jesus or not. But to choose to believe is to choose to be in a relationship with God and with each other. We oftentimes leave that "and with each other" out of the equation. When we choose to believe, we become a partner in this relationship, and that includes being part of the community that is bound to God and Jesus, just as they are bound to one another. From John's perspective, our relationship with one another in this community of faith is an extension of the relationship between God and Jesus. Think about that for a minute. Our relationships with one another in this community of faith are an extension of the relationship between God and Jesus. That's really profound. There's a holiness in this perspective that we tend to overlook. I mean, it's humbling to think about our participation in the community of faith as an extension of God and Jesus. It's also uncomfortable to think that our participation in a faith community was so important that Jesus linked the meaning of his death to it. We are the fruit of Jesus' death. We are the vehicle that shows God's love to the world. That is a lot to think about. We are the fruit of Jesus' death. So the way that we live into our relationship with God and the church will have an impact then on the way we can do ministry as a congregation. It's all about relationship. It's a partnership. It's an honor and a privilege, even as much as it is a responsibility. And I promise you that it may feel overwhelming, but it's important for us to remember that undergirding all of this theological thinking is love. Loving God, loving Jesus, loving each other, just as God and Jesus have loved us. I believe that's happening all around us. And that's why I asked you to think of a time that you could remember experiencing God's love in this community. And that's why I'm coming with a microphone, and I'm hoping some of you will be willing to share. Does anybody have a story, a time when you felt God's love in this community? Kevin.
I have two. Cheryl just had surgery last week, and the love and outpouring from this community has just been wonderful. The meals and the calls and everything. It's been great. And I feel love in this community all the time. But the one thing I thought of when you immediately said it was this morning I was with Miles and Gingy Watts, and we were teaching 12 through 14-year-olds down in room 18 about connecting to God and what it means to connect to God. And them sharing their experiences of doing that was just outstanding. It's an experience that I find I get to experience every Sunday.
That's very cool. Thank you. Anybody else have a story you're willing to share? David.
Pretty simple. Baptism of both our children. There's nothing more loving than the congregation taking them on and taking them under their care.
Tony, did you have one? Nope. Anybody? It's all the people on the fringes. Rick.
And really, I'm in the process of feeling the love of the community, God's love through the community in the process where we're mourning my mother's death.
Thank you. Amy.
Yes. I'll just say the very day that we entered the church, we were dropping Magnolia off on, I see you, in the children's wing, and I happened to pass Katie Hearn in the hallway. And we had been church shopping for probably a couple months and just hadn't found the right home yet. And turns out Katie and I went to college together and didn't know each other that well, but enough to know that I knew that face. And so then she was like, yeah, we've gone to church here, forever, and our kids go here, and then there's a lot of other kids that go here, and then their parents also went to Truman State, and then everyone went to Truman State. And so we tried it out, and as we were leaving, Andrew goes, well, another church, what'd you think? And I was like, they all went to Truman State, and we know them. And I was like, we don't need to church or search shop anywhere else. We're hooked. So just like the passing in the hallway, it's a God thing. So we definitely felt it.
Thank you. It's all about relationships.
Just a few moments ago, Amy's daughter Magnolia was in the 2s and 3s Sunday school, and it's a very interesting and fun class to teach. And little Magnolia just could not stop coming back to hug Megan and me several times. It was just so loving.
It's wonderful. Thank you. Any others? Rosemary.
Well, we're really new here at Grace Covenant, but the love that we have felt while we have been here, and the last 6 months when our daughter was diagnosed with triple-negative breast cancer, it was a terrible thing to have to go through and a shock to us, but I just have felt so much love from all of you and the prayer warriors that have been present. I just can't tell you how much that's meant to me and the people that have reached out to us. And I'm glad to say that she's gone through her chemo, she's gone through her breast cancer surgery, and she will be back in the classroom with her students tomorrow after 6 months. And she has radiation ahead of her, but we think we've gone through the worst. But to get that diagnosis as cancer-free was, I just can't even begin to tell you what it means. So thank you for your love. And I also serve on the welcoming committee, or welcoming team. And it's always a pleasure to see all the new faces that have come into the church. And in 2 years, I've really enjoyed doing that. And thank you very much for all your love, support, and all the many blessings that you've given to our family. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosemary. Jean.
music was the basis of my relationship with my wife for 57 years. And we always sang together. You'll notice that our license plate says 2 singers. I cannot tell you how many times singing an anthem we couldn't complete it because it was such a spiritual moment. And to the time she died, music continued to be the basis of her faith and mine. And this church was the strong influence that kept us here in this community.
Thank you. Last fall, I ended up having to go to the ER because I had a bacterial form of food poisoning. And Mitch was in California at the stewardship conference. And Charlie went with me to the hospital, so I had some company, but I really didn't feel so great, and the doctor didn't want me to really drive. But I drove myself to the hospital anyway. But after hours of sitting there, and they give you lots of fluids, and they run a ton of tests and stuff, they finally dismissed me, gave me my meds, and were sending me home. And when I walked out into the waiting room, one of the nurses that was waiting there said, "Your ride is waiting for you in the lobby." And there was Kathy Williams to take me home on a rainy night when it wasn't great weather and I felt like poo. And she came to my rescue to take me home. I felt the love of God that day. These stories matter because relationship is what it's all about. I encourage you to think of those stories and don't just set them aside, but file them ready to share them because the world is hungry for stories of love and the possibility and the hope of finding that kind of love for themselves. We have it right here. All we have to do is tell each other. Thanks be to God for the glorification of Jesus that lives among us today. Amen.